Today, we're covering 5 cases with twists that I know you won't see coming. In May 1994, a house was being renovated in San Marino, California. The project was going to plan, except that when the backyard was dug up for a pool to be installed, human remains were found buried there. The discovery was shocking for the area known to be a rather sleepy suburb. The remains had been buried about 4 feet underground and wrapped up in 3 plastic bags tied together with twine. The bones were believed to belong to an adult white male who had been bludgeoned on the head by a blunt object and stabbed 6 times, including slashes in the flannel shirt the deceased was wearing. Before the house's most recent owners, the house had belonged to Dee Dee Soas. Dee Dee had lived there with her son John and his wife Linda in the 1980s. John was a computer programmer and his wife worked as a sci-fi artist. Also on the property was a British baronet named Christopher Chichester, who Dee Dee let live rent-free in the guest house. John and Linda didn't stay with Dee Dee for long. On February 8, 1985, the couple decided to move from California to New York to find jobs. Or at least, that was one story. Linda had also told her mother, Susan Mayfield, that she was headed to Connecticut for a couple weeks with John, but then no one heard from either of them. 2 months after they left, they were reported missing. For a long time, there was no sign of either John or Linda, but then Linda's mother received a mysterious postcard from Paris, France. It read, "Mom, I think we need a geography lesson, but not too bad. Linda and John." 2 other postcards were sent, allegedly also from Linda. Linda's mother said that her daughter didn't have enough money to travel all the way to France when she had disappeared, and also that she didn't even have a passport. Because of this, her family doesn't believe that the postcards were actually sent by Linda. Even stranger, though, the handwriting on the postcards was analyzed, and it was determined that Linda had written at least one. And they weren't the only ones to go missing. Soon after John and Linda left, Christopher Chichester disappeared as well. But unlike the Soases, no one was really looking for him, yet. The case of John and Linda Soas' disappearance went cold for a decade. Then, 10 years later, remains were found in Dee Dee's old backyard. After forensic analysis, the bones were determined to be John Soas's. He hadn't gone missing at all. He'd been killed. Though John's disappearance had been upgraded to a murder inquiry, the couple's case soon went cold again. Seemingly unrelated, in 2008, a man named J.P. Clark Rockefeller was on the run after kidnapping his daughter in Boston during his parental visit. After a week-long manhunt, Rockefeller was found and faced charges of kidnapping, assault, and battery with a dangerous weapon, and endangering a minor. But his unintentional publicity revealed something else. Clark Rockefeller looked familiar. In fact, he looked just like Christopher Chichester, who had been living in the guest house of the Soases back in the 80s. Clark Rockefeller and Christopher Chichester were the same man, but neither was his real name. He was also known as Christopher Mountbatten Crowe, James Frederick Michael Brown, and Chip Smith. But his real name was Christian Gerhartsreiter. He wasn't a British aristocrat, as he had told the Soases, but a German national who came to America in 1978 at age 17. His entire life, Gerhartsreiter had lied about who he was, creating elaborate cons. Over the years, he had told people he was an Ivy League graduate and Hollywood producer, a bond broker on Wall Street where he had somehow actually overseen an entire department of real bond brokers, and lastly, a descendant of the wealthy Rockefeller family, a con he used for about 20 years. Gerhartsreiter conned his way into high society, lied to get important jobs, and even into a marriage with a wealthy woman where he controlled much of her money. His cons had been so good that he wasn't caught until he'd kidnapped his daughter. Gerhartsreiter actually denies that he's German and instead claims to be the son of Ann Carter, an American child actress from the 1940s. Carter, on the other hand, denies that he is her son. Once Gerhartsreiter's many cons were revealed, investigators took a new look at the Soas' disappearance from 20 years earlier. It couldn't be a coincidence that such a successful conman had been their tenant when John was killed, could it? Much of the evidence was all circumstantial. Another problem with the case was that over the years, the upper and lower jaw that were found in the backyard were missing. And tragically, the coroner's office speculates that they were probably cremated. Despite all these issues, Gerhardt's Reiter was charged with John Sohus's murder. Gerhardt's Reiter denied it, but it was revealed that while staying with them, Gerhardt's Reiter had told John and Linda he was a secret agent and that he had managed to get John a secret government job and secret mission, which was where they were headed to when they left California, if they even did. Evidence against Gerhardt's Reiter included an elderly couple who claimed he tried to sell them a rug while still living at the Sohus house with a quarter-size spot of blood on it. He later admitted to burning a rug, assumed to be the same one, when smoke was seen coming out of the guest house. A neighbor said that Gerhardt's Reiter borrowed a chainsaw in the spring of 1985. Also, while in the guest house, Gerhardt's Reiter had a friend over who asked why the backyard was being dug up, and he told them because of plumbing problems. 4 years after the Sohuses went missing, John's truck was found in Connecticut where it was being sold by Christopher Chichester. When he vanished after John and Linda went missing, he seemed to go into hiding, dyeing his hair blonde and growing a beard. Yet even with all of this, Gerhardt's Reiter's defense team alleged that the real killer was John's own wife, Linda, and since she was still missing, they proposed that she had killed him and intentionally vanished. The proof was the postcards from Europe allegedly sent by Linda, but her friends disputed this, saying the couple had been happily married. Prosecution thought that maybe Gerhardt's Reiter had sent the postcards to cover his tracks to make the Sohuses appear to be alive and well, and to frame Linda. Inside a locker that he rented in Baltimore were multiple postcards from international cities. It was theorized that Gerhardt's Reiter could have had someone living in Europe who sent the postcards for him. Another theory was that Linda and Gerhardt's Reiter could have been having an affair, and perhaps together they killed John. Or that Gerhardt's Reiter had killed John out of jealousy over Linda. More likely, though, the lead investigator suggested that Gerhardt's Reiter had been trying to con Dee Dee out of her house, which was quite valuable, hoping she would leave the place to him. His only real obstacle in this plot was John. As her biological son, she would have to disinherit him for Gerhardt's Reiter to inherit, which is exactly what she did. After years of not hearing from John, Dee Dee felt her son had abandoned her. She didn't make Gerhardt's Reiter her inheritor, but instead a couple, the Weatherbys, who took care of her at the end of her life. And who had introduced them? Gerhardt's Reiter. It came to light that the Weatherbys had made a deal with Gerhardt's Reiter. If he introduced them to vulnerable Dee Dee, they would pay him with the money from her estate when she died. In fact, they had given him $40,000 and had promised him another $100,000. Even though this information seems vital to the case, it was never brought up in court. Despite this, Gerhardt's Reiter was still found guilty of the first-degree murder of John Sohus. To this day, there is still no sign of Linda Sohus. The Whitaker family in Sugar Land, Texas, was as close to perfect as any family could be. Made up of Kent, who worked at the family-owned construction business, and his wife Patricia, a former elementary school teacher, and their 2 sons, 23-year-old Bart and 19-year-old Kevin. In December of 2003, the family celebrated Bart's graduation from Sam Houston State University over dinner. There, Kent and Patricia gave Bart a stunning gift, a $4,000 Rolex watch. This luxurious present was just like the other gifts they had given Bart, such as multiple luxury vehicles, even a lakeside townhouse, and paid for his tuition at Baylor University, and more recently, Sam Houston State. After dinner, the family returned home. As soon as Kevin entered the front door, he was shot in the chest by a masked intruder waiting inside the home. The bullet hit his heart. Patricia was right behind him, and she was also shot in the chest. Kent was still on the front porch. The bullet that struck him went in at an angle, through his chest only 6 inches from his heart and into his shoulder, where it shattered his humerus bone. When they got home, Bart had headed to his Chevrolet Yukon to grab his cell phone to check for messages, but hearing gunshots, he rushed into the house to confront the shooter. There they fought, and Bart was shot in the arm, but the gunman escaped out the back door. Kevin died minutes after being shot. Patricia was airlifted to the hospital, but she died before she ever made it. Only Kent and Bart survived their wounds. It was assumed to be a robbery that the Whitakers disturbed, but the scene looked staged. The drawers were only slightly opened and nothing inside was disturbed. and expensive items in the house were left where they were. A 9mm Glock handgun registered to Kevin was found at the crime scene, and a men's black leather glove lying on the curb near Bart's Yukon. The intruder got into the house through a crawl space in Kevin's room on the second floor. There, they broke into his gun safe and stole his gun, which was a gift from Bart. As the investigation got underway, something weird was revealed. Bart hadn't been enrolled in Sam Houston University at all. He'd been lying to his parents about going to school and taking the money they gave him for tuition. This was strange, but seemed unrelated. Then Adam Hipp came forward. He had gone to school with Bart at Clemens High School, and he told detectives that only 2 years prior, in 2001, Bart had asked for his help killing his parents. The plan was for Hipp to be the gunman, waiting in the Whitaker home while the family went out for dinner. When they returned, he was supposed to shoot Kent, Patricia, and Kevin, killing them, and shoot Bart in the arm to make it seem like he had also been a target, not the mastermind. All sounds pretty familiar, right? Here's the really eerie part. Kent and Patricia knew about the plot to kill them. They were called by the police after someone heard about the plan. At the time, it was seen as too far out to be real, and Bart told his parents that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Shockingly, it soon came to light that Bart had recruited another student from Baylor to pull off a similar plan a year earlier in 2000, but it had fallen through. As part of a deal to avoid being prosecuted for playing a role in the earlier plot, Hipp agreed to help with the investigation into the Whitaker shooting. To do this, he agreed to record his conversations with Bart. In one of these conversations, Bart offered Hipp $20,000 to lie to the police about his involvement in the 2001 plot. He even sent $240 to a post office box in Dallas the two had set up for the money. Why the police didn't bring Bart in, I'm not sure, but they regretted it in 2004 when Bart's Yukon was found still running but empty near a Houston apartment complex. For over a year, there was no sign of Bart. Police turned to the people who had been close to Bart at the time of the shooting, including a roommate, Chris Brashear, and a co-worker, Stephen Champagne, to see if they knew where he'd gone. The police wiretapped both young men's phones and subpoenaed their friends and family. This proved to be the last straw for Champagne because he went to police and confessed. Not that he knew where Bart was, but to picking up Brashear from the Whitaker's house on the night of the shooting. Brashear, he said, had been the shooter. The only thing left was to find Bart. In September, a man named Rudy Rios told the police a shocking story. He said that Bart had bought his ID from him and paid him to drive him to Mexico. Once in Mexico, Bart used Rudy's ID and told people weird stories, like his gunshot wound was a war injury he got in Afghanistan, that he was an orphan and his mother had been a prostitute. Finally, Bart was tracked down and arrested. Bart had orchestrated his family's shooting so he could inherit $1.5 million, though he claimed he'd done it because he'd cracked under the immense pressure his family placed on him. He told Champagne and Brashear he would pay them millions from his inheritance if they went along with his plan. Brashear made a plea bargain for life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, while Champagne was given 15 years in exchange for testifying and is no longer in prison. A jury only needed a half hour to find Bart guilty of capital murder and sentence him to death. Surprisingly, and to many people's disbelief, the person campaigning for Bart's life to be spared was his father, who he'd tried to kill not once but 3 times. On February 22, 2018, at exactly 6 p.m., Bart was to be executed. He ate his final meal, and at 5:15, just as Bart was about to be strapped to the gurney, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after his father's campaigning saved his life. Today, Bart's father visits him in prison, where he will be for the rest of his life. In November 2010, 13-year-old Yara Gambarasio headed out just after 5 p.m. to practice gymnastics. The gym was only just a few hundred meters from her house in Brambate di Sopra, Italy. By 7 p.m., she still wasn't home. When her parents couldn't get a hold of her, they called the police. Within minutes, both state police officers and military police were dispatched to find Yara. The young girl was seen leaving the gym by her instructor, and she had sent a text message to a friend at 6:44. but that was the last time anyone saw or heard from her. Bloodhounds followed Yara's scent away from her home and towards a small hamlet called Mapillo, where her phone also pinged last. The in-depth investigation to find Yara began with the wiretapping of hundreds of phones, attempting to trace who had been in Mapillo and near Yara's home. The wiretaps revealed a strange comment made by a Moroccan man named Mohammed Fikri. He was overheard saying, "Forgive me, God, I didn't kill her," by interpreters. Investigators looked into Fikri only to discover that he had boarded a boat to Tangier. Finding the whole thing suspicious, Fikri was arrested. A blood-stained mattress was found in his possession, and it was assumed something horrible had happened to Yara. But once in custody, it was revealed that Fikri had been mistranslated, and the blood wasn't Yara's. With Fikri's release, Italy's attention fell on the investigation of the missing young girl. The country was horrified when 3 months later a man flying a radio-controlled airplane saw something strange among the weeds in a field, a small pair of shoes. It was Yara's decomposed and frozen body. Because of the media attention surrounding the case, the autopsy was conducted by Italy's most famous forensic pathologist. Yara had died from exposure after she was attacked and left in the field. She hadn't been assaulted, but she had a dozen lacerations from a sharp object. There were traces of lime in Yara's respiratory passages and traces of a vegetable fiber used to make rope on her clothing, which suggested that whoever attacked her worked in construction. A male's DNA sample was recovered from Yara's underwear, which implied the attacker had been hurt in a struggle with her. Because the evidence was so slim, the case focused on the DNA sample. The investigation was huge. In fact, it was the most expensive manhunt in Italian history. 18,000 DNA samples would be taken over the course of the investigation. After thousands of tests, investigators found something. The sample found on Yara closely matched a man named Damiano Garanoni. But Garanoni had been in South America when Yara disappeared, and his DNA didn't match exactly. Instead, Garanoni was related to Yara's killer. The problem was Garanoni's father had 11 brothers and sisters, which expanded the search enormously. Desperately looking for a match, Garanoni's uncle Giuseppe was sought for a DNA sample, but he had died back in 1999, 11 years before Yara was killed. Still, Giuseppe's widow showed investigators a box with some of his old documents. Inside was a paper copy of his driving license and a postcard he sent to his family. Both had stamps that Giuseppe had licked before he died, and police realized that they could get a DNA sample from them. The DNA confirmed that Giuseppe Garanoni was the father of Yara's suspected murderer. Giuseppe had 3 children, a girl and 2 boys, Pier Paolo and Diego, yet neither son matched the DNA of the killer, and neither had children. There was only one answer. Giuseppe had an illegitimate child, whose DNA was found on Yara. Giuseppe Garanoni's body was even exhumed so his DNA could be verified as the father of the suspect, which it was. The hunt now was to uncover Giuseppe's affair that had happened 30 to 40 years prior. Soon, people realized that the police were looking for an affair, and gossip, tips, and old secrets started rolling in. A tip came in from one of Giuseppe's friends at his workplace as a bus driver who said Giuseppe had gotten a woman in trouble in the 70s or 80s. They believed that her name was Esther Arzuffi, but Arzuffi's DNA had already been tested, and there was no match. That's when investigators realized a mistake had been made. Her DNA hadn't been tested against the suspects, but Yara's. Arzuffi denied ever having an affair. She was married and was adamant that her twins, a boy and girl, weren't Giuseppe's. The boy's name was Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti. Was Massimo's middle name just a coincidence? Investigators weren't convinced that Arzuffi was telling the truth. Now 43, Massimo was a builder and lived in Mapillo, the hamlet near Yara's home. He worked in construction, which could explain the lime found on Yara. Police set up a fake roadblock for breathalyzing and took 2 DNA samples from Massimo when he passed through. He was Giuseppe's biological son and an exact match to Yara's suspected killer. Massimo was found guilty of killing Yara Gambarosio and sentenced to life in prison for her murder. Interestingly, Massimo's mother still denies having an affair and says the whole thing is inexplicable. On December 15, 1980, 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a divorced mother of an 8-year-old son and a nurse in California, didn't show up for work at Pacoima Memorial Hospital. When her co-workers couldn't get her on the phone, they called the authorities to report her missing. Melanie's disappearance made headlines, but there was no sign of what happened to her. 2 days after she was reported missing, a shipping clerk working at the Lockheed Aerospace plant, Etta Louise Smith, listened to a news report about Melanie when something strange happened. The aerospace worker would later describe that she had a feeling, a vision, a psychic experience, whatever you want to call it. Etta saw a woman's body laying somewhere on a remote hillside in Lopez Canyon, above Lakeview Terrace. Etta had to tell the police she knew the location of Melanie's body and report her psychic experience. Despite skepticism, Etta's security clearance and career meant that investigators didn't send her away. They had her point on a map to the place she'd seen in her vision. Etta headed home, picked up 2 of her kids and her niece, and drove out to the spot where she had seen Melanie's body. She worried that the police wouldn't take her seriously and check. Together, they searched the canyon road. After about 30 minutes of looking, Etta's daughter caught sight of a nude body. Etta called forest rangers and police and showed them the horrific discovery. It was Melanie Uribe. She had been kidnapped, assaulted, and beaten to death. The police were immediately suspicious of Etta. How had a random woman's psychic vision found Melanie? They thought she had to be connected to the crime and took Etta in for questioning, keeping her there for 10 hours. Then she was strip-searched and left barefoot in a cell and wasn't given anything to eat or drink for 24 hours. Investigators hoped Etta would eventually break and admit how she had really learned about Melanie's body. Though no evidence connected Etta to the crime, she was arrested on December 18th, the day after her vision. While all this was happening, a man was bragging about having just robbed, beaten, and killed a woman. The neighbors he was boasting to turned to the police and shared the disturbing story. He was arrested on December 21st, and when questioned, he implicated 2 other men in the crime. They were a 17-year-old who wasn't named, 20-year-old Luis Carnell Morgan, and 21-year-old Spencer Nelson. The 3 men had spotted Melanie as she sat in her pickup truck waiting at a traffic light and jumped into her truck before forcing her to drive into the canyon, where they attacked, robbed, and assaulted her before hitting her in the head with a rock. Police were sure the men had some connection to Etta, but none knew her. 4 days after she'd been arrested, Etta was released. If Etta didn't know Melanie and didn't know her killers, how had she done it? Was it truly a psychic experience like she says? Police offered their own explanation. Rather than a psychic vision, they say she must have figured out the location of Melanie's body from neighborhood gossip or other natural means. Melanie's 3 killers were all convicted of her murder and are serving sentences of up to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta Smith sued the Los Angeles police for false arrest. She won her suit and was awarded $26,184. Etta didn't have any more visions, or at least ones she told anyone about. In September 2010, 55-year-old Greg Flanagan, a Louisiana oilman, walked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. He went into his room, number 348, but he never came out again. Greg and his wife Susie usually talked on the phone every morning, but the next day he hadn't called her, and he didn't show up at his office. Greg was found by 2 of his co-workers who went to the hotel to find him. They had the hotel manager open his room. His body was on the floor, the television still on, candy bars and cigarettes scattered near the bed, and the $1,000 he had in cash was still in his room. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of a struggle, no sign that anyone but Greg had been in the room. There wasn't any blood or wounds on his body. Greg smoked a lot, so much so that a cigarette was still stuck between 2 of his fingers when he died. It was assumed that Greg's death was from natural causes, something like a heart attack. Still, his body was sent to the medical examiner to confirm the cause of death. Everything about his death seemed to be unremarkable. But the examination revealed something unexpected. His ribs were broken. There were lacerations to his liver, stomach, and scrotum, and a hole in his heart. There was bruising around his groin and right hip. Some of his partially digested food had been torn from his intestines. His chest had taken a blow that was so severe it would have been lethal. His death was ruled a homicide. Greg Flanagan had been beaten or crushed to death. Investigators didn't believe the autopsy. It didn't fit with the crime scene. There wasn't even anything heavy enough in his room to crush him. But the report was clear. Greg had suffered the type of severe internal injuries of crash victims or someone crushed by a heavy object. But there was one incredibly important and strange detail. All this damage to Greg's internal organs didn't significantly damage his torso. There was almost no bruising except around his groin, meaning all his injuries were very internal. There were only a few plausible explanations. Greg must have been beaten up somewhere else before returning to his room where he died. But because of the trauma his body suffered, he would have bled out internally in less than 30 seconds. So there was just no way Greg would have made it back to his room. He had to have been beaten in his room, but there wasn't any piece of evidence. Nothing disturbed, and the people in the room next door reported that they hadn't heard anything. Doesn't make any sense, does it? The only unusual thing investigators could find was that early in the evening, Greg had made microwave popcorn and blown an electrical circuit. The circuit breaker in his room had to be fixed that night, and the maintenance man was sent up. This led to a theory. The maintenance man was a known sex offender. Perhaps the damage to Greg's scrotum and internal injuries had been caused by a bizarre and horrific assault. This theory was thrown out as the maintenance worker had an alibi. The next theory involved the men staying in the room next door to Greg. It was a group of electricians who often met in one room at night to drink. Perhaps when Greg knocked out the power, they became angry and had a fight with him, beating him in the hallway before he crawled back into his room where he died. This didn't seem plausible as the men said they didn't see Greg, and his injuries still didn't quite fit a beating. As well, the cigarette found in his hand seemed too casual a gesture to fit being beaten. This case was one of the most puzzling investigators had come across, and it stalled for months. Greg's family eventually offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who had information, but no one came forward. The legendary private investigator and former Long Island cop and DEA special agent Ken Brennan took on Greg's case. Brennan set about interviewing everyone, including Greg's wife and the medical examiner. There was a clue that no one else noticed. The cigarette in Greg's hand had been found in his left, but his wife insisted he smoked with his right. Brennan's explanation was that he must have stood up and switched the hand the cigarette was in, perhaps to open the door. This clue led back to the electricians in the room next door. Perhaps Greg had stood up to answer the door when they knocked after he had blown the power. Some of his injuries, such as the laceration to his scrotum, could have been caused by a kick from steel-toed boots like electricians might wear. As Brennan interviewed the electricians, he realized the theory had been dismissed for a reason. But something else was revealed during these interviews. One of the men commented about a gun going off in a hotel. Brennan suddenly had a theory. The hotel room was inspected again, this time looking for a bullet. After hours of searching, nothing was found. That is, until Brennan noticed a small repaired indentation in the wall. Checking the room next door, he found the small mark of a bullet entering the wall. The exit had to be that indentation in Greg's room. Greg had been shot. The medical examiner didn't buy Brennan's theory. There wasn't a bullet wound on Greg's body, and they wouldn't have missed something like a bullet wound. But together they re-examined the autopsy photos. Brennan asked if a bullet could have entered Greg's body through his scrotum, as there were lacerations there and bruising. The examiner agreed it was possible if it entered at just the right angle, and it would have disguised a bullet entry because of the folds of flesh. A bullet would have torn up through his body, explaining the blunt force trauma to his organs that looked like a severe beating. It was the hole in Greg's heart that convinced the examiner. Previously thought to be a burst right atrium from blunt force trauma, the doctor realized it was actually a bullet hole. Greg had been shot after all. The night Greg died, a few of the electricians were drinking in the room next door. One of them, Lance Mueller, was playing around with a 9mm Ruger pistol. It accidentally went off, the bullet going through the wall and into Greg's room where it struck him as he held his cigarette. He collapsed right there, leaving almost no evidence of what had happened. At the time, the electricians weren't sure someone was staying next door to them, as they weren't lying when they said they hadn't seen Greg. Mueller used toothpaste to try to hide the evidence of a bullet hole in his room. And when Greg's death was ruled natural causes, Mueller thought it was all a horrible coincidence. He was arrested and charged with the manslaughter of Greg Flanagan. In court, he pleaded no contest to reckless manslaughter and criminally negligent manslaughter charges. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years. The circumstances of Greg's twist-filled case might be one of the strangest I've ever heard.